They say a man's fate is written in the stars, but mine was forged in the cold, silent fury of a wedding night that should never have happened. I remember the weight of the air in that carriage, thick with the scent of rain and the unspoken hatred of the woman sitting across from me. Her name is Seraphina, a name that sounds like an angel's breath. Yet she looked at me as if I were the very devil who had dragged her into the depths of a nightmare. I am Alistair St, the Duke of Windermere. I was supposed to marry the perfect sister, the one who would have been a quiet, decorative ornament in my ancestral halls. Instead, I found myself bound by law and scandal to a woman whose eyes held the embers of a rebellion I wasn't prepared to fight. "You look as though you're counting the miles to your own execution," I said, my voice echoing against the velvet interior of the coach. I watched the flickering lamplight dance across the sharp line of her jaw. She was beautiful in a way that felt like a warning. Seraphina didn't flinch. She adjusted her silk gloves, her movement precise and elegant, despite the chaos of our union. "Execution would be swifter, Your Grace. At least, then, the suffering would have an end. This is a life sentence." I felt a dark amusement tug at the corner of my mouth. A life sentence in a palace, with the finest silks and a title that makes the world bow? Many would call that a dream. "Many are fools," she snapped, finally meeting my gaze. Her eyes were wide, dark, and swimming with defiance that made my blood hum. I was a bargaining chip, a sacrifice to clean up my sister's mess. "Do not expect me to thank you for rescuing my reputation by making me your prisoner." I leaned forward, the space between us shrinking until I could feel the heat radiating from her skin. "I did not ask for a sacrifice, Seraphina. I asked for a wife. And since the church and the crown have seen fit to give me you, I suggest you learn that I am a man who expects a return on his investments." It was a cool thing to say, a mask I wore to hide the sudden, inconvenient surge of desire that hit me when she bit her lip to keep it from trembling. She was my duty, my sin, and in that moment, she was the only thing in the world that felt real. "You will have your return in public appearances in a well-managed household," she whispered, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "But inside those walls, Alistair, you are a stranger to me. You will never touch me. Not while there is still breath in my body to say, no, duh." The carriage jolted as we hit a rut in the road, throwing her forward. I caught her by the waist, my hand sinking into the soft lace of her gown. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. I could feel the frantic beat of her heart against my palms, like a trapped bird. The scent of her, sandalwood and something fiercely feminine, invaded my senses. I didn't let go. I let my fingers linger on the curve of her hip, watching her breath hitch. "A bold vow," I murmured, my voice dropping to a low, gravelly rasp. "But midnight is a long time away, and the nights in the north are very, very cold." She wrenched herself away from me, retreating to the corner of the seat, her eyes blazing. I would rather freeze than seek warmth from a heart of stone. I sat back, the ghost of her touch still burning my palms. I had spent my life controlling every variable, every emotion, every person. But as we crossed the border into my lands, I realized that for the first time, I was the one being hunted, and the predator was a woman in a white dress who swore she would never love me. The gates of Windermere loomed ahead, iron and imposing. As the carriage slowed, I looked at her one last time before the world saw us as a Duke and Duchess. "Welcome home, Seraphina," I said, the words feeling like a vow of my own. "Let us see how long your ice holds against my fire." The stone walls of Windermere did not welcome us. They stood as silent, imposing witnesses to a union born of desperation. As we stepped into the grand foyer, the servants stood in a line, their faces masked of professional neutrality, though I could feel their curiosity burning like a fever. They had expected the soft, malleable Christable. Instead, I was handing them Seraphina, a woman who looked as though she were ready to burn the entire state to the ground if it meant she could be free. "Show the Duchess to her chambers," I commanded, my voice echoing in the vast space. "And see that a fire is lit. The mist is rolling in from the mows." She didn't look at me. She didn't even acknowledge my presence as she followed the housekeeper up the sweeping marble staircase. I watched the hem of her white gown disappear around the landing, and for a moment the silence of the house felt deafening. I retreated to my study, pouring a glass of brandy that tasted like ash. I told myself I was relieved to be rid of her for the evening. I told myself that a marriage of convenience was exactly what I had wanted. But my mind was a traitor. It kept replaying the way her waist felt beneath my hands in the carriage, the way her scent, that intoxicating mix of rain and defiance, had filled my lungs. An hour passed. Then, too, the house settled into that deep, midnight stillness that usually brought me peace. But tonight, it felt like a trap. I found myself walking. My boots made no sound on the thick Persian rugs as I moved toward the east wing. Toward her. I told myself I was checking on her comfort. A lie. I was a moth drawn to a flame that promised only to consume me. When I reached her door, I paused. I could hear the faint crackle of the hearth inside. I didn't knock. I am the Duke. I do not knock in my own house. I pushed the door open, and the breath caught in my throat. She had shed the heavy wedding silk. She stood by the window, wearing only a thin, translucent shift of lawn cotton that caught the amber glow of the fire. Her hair, which had been pinned in a severe crown all day, now fell in dark, chaotic waves down her back, reaching the curve of her hips. She was staring out at the darkened moors, her silhouette a masterpiece of grace and sorrow. "I told you I would not share your bed, Alistair," she said, without turning around. Her voice was a low hum in the quiet room. Does a duke lack the manners to respect a lady's privacy? "A duke respects what is his, Seraphina," I replied, closing the door softly behind me. The click of I walked toward her, my gaze fixed on hers. I could see the pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat. "Property does not make my blood boil, Seraphina. Property does not make me forget my own name." I stopped just inches from her. The heat between us was a physical thing, a living entity that demanded to be fed. I reached out, my fingers grazing the skin of her shoulder. She gasped, a small, broken sound, but she didn't pull away. "You hate me," she whispered, though her eyes were searching mine with a desperate intensity. "I find I am beginning to hate how much I want you," I confessed, my voice a dark caress. "I want to break that wall of yours, Seraphina. I want to hear you scream my name, not in anger, but in a way that proves you are as haunted by this as I am." I slid my hand up to her neck, my thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She was trembling now, but she leaned into my touch, a silent surrender that set my soul on fire. "Then do it," she challenged, her voice trembling. "Break me. But know that even if you take my body, you will never have the rest. You will be holding a shell while the woman inside dreams of someone else." That was the dagger. The thought of her dreaming of another man made a primal, possessive fury erupt within me. I gripped her waist, pulling her flush against me, feeling every curve, every line of her through the thin cotton. "Then I shall have to make sure you have no breath left for dreams," I growled. My mouth crashed down onto hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It tasted of brandy, salt, and a hunger so deep it felt like a void. She fought me for a second, her hands pushing against my chest, but then her fingers curled into my shirt, and she was kissing me back with a ferocity that matched my own. It was a battle of tongues and teeth, a desperate attempt to claim what was forbidden. I backed her toward the heavy mahogany bed, my hands roaming over her skin, finding the heat she had tried so hard to hide. She was fire and ice, a storm caught in a silk cage, and as we fell onto the velvet coverlet, I knew I was lost. "Alistair," she breathed against my lips, and for the first time it didn't sound like a curse. The air in the room seemed to vanish, replaced by the sheer, overwhelming heat of our bodies colliding. I had expected resistance, I had almost craved it to justify my own anger, but the way Seraphina's lips parted beneath mine felt less like a surrender and more like an awakening. Her taste was intoxicating, a mix of the sweet wine she'd barely touched and a primal, feminine heat that threatened to undo every bit of my composure. I pressed her back against the pillows, my weight pinning her to the bed as my hands found the delicate ribbons of her shift. My pulse was thundering in my ears, a rhythmic drumbeat of desire that drowned out the voice of reason. I wanted to claim her, to mark her as mine so thoroughly that the memory of her sister, the scandal, and the hollow duty would be burned away. "Alistair," she gasped, her voice catching as my mouth left hers to trace the sensitive line of her throat. Her head fell back, her neck arching in a way that invited more. You shouldn't. This isn't what we agreed." "The agreement died the moment you looked at me in that carriage," I murmured against her skin, my breath hot and ragged. I moved lower, my lips grazing the swell of her breast through the thin fabric. "You said I was your gala, Seraphina. But look at you. You're not fighting the bars. You're reaching for the fire." She let out a low, shuddering moan that was my undoing. Her fingers, which had been clutching my shoulders, slid upward, burying themselves in my hair, pulling me closer. The defiance was still there, flickering in her eyes like a dying candle, but it was being rapidly eclipsed by a hunger she clearly hadn't known she possessed. I didn't wait. With a sharp tug, the silk gave way, bearing her to the amber glow of the hearth. She was perfection, pale, glowing skin, curves that seemed designed to fit the hollows of my hands, and eyes that were now dark with a longing that mirrored my own. I stripped away my own clothes with a frantic energy I hadn't felt since my youth, my gaze never leaving haze. When I moved back over her, the contact of skin against skin felt like a lightning strike. She was so soft, so impossibly warm. I began to explore her, my hands memorizing the landscape of her body, from the delicate curve of her ribs to the sensitive skin of her inner thighs. Every touch elicited a new sound from her, a sharp intake of breath, a soft whimper, a desperate plea for more. "Please," she whispered, her legs tangling with mine, her body arching toward me in a silent, ancient demand. I looked down at her, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Look at me, Seraphina. I want you to know exactly who is holding you. I want you to remember this when the sun rises." I entered her slowly, the sheer intensity of the connection making my vision blur. She gasped, her eyes snapping open, locked onto mine. There was a moment of crystalline clarity, a bridge formed between two souls who had spent their lives in isolation. Then the rhythm took over. It was a slow burn that turned into a conflagration. I moved with a desperate, driving need, and she met me stroke for stroke, her body moving in perfect, instinctive harmony with mine. The world outside, the moles, the title, the debt of honor, ceased to exist. There was only the scent of her skin, the sound of our mingled breaths, and the mounting tension that felt like it would shatter my very bones. When the climax hit, it was like a physical blow. I felt her shatter beneath me, her body tightening in a series of exquisite tremors as she cried out my name. I followed her into the abyss a second later, my own release so powerful it left me gasping, my forehead resting against hers as we drifted back to reality. The fire in the hearth had dimmed to glowing embers. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of what had just happened. I held her, my arms wrapped tightly around her as our heartbeats slowly began to sink. "You promised never to love me," I whispered into the darkness, my voice rough with exhaustion and something else I wasn't ready to name. She didn't answer for a long time. She just lay there, her head resting on my chest, her fingers tracing a mindless pattern over my skin. "I promised many things, Alistair," she finally said, her voice small and fragile. "But I never promised I wouldn't burn." I pulled her closer, the guilt of how I had obtained her ward with a new, terrifying possessiveness. I had broken her vow, but in doing so, I had forged a bond that I knew would haunt us both. As sleep finally claimed me, I realized that the replacement bride had become the only woman I had ever truly seen. The morning light was a cool interrogator, stripping away the shadows where we had hidden our sins. When I woke, the space beside me was cold. Seraphina had already retreated, leaving nothing but the scent of crushed jasmine and the indentation of a head on the pillow. I found her in the breakfast room, fully dressed in a high-collared gown of slate gray, looking every bit the untouchable Duchess. But as I entered, I saw her hand tremble as she lifted a teacup. "You are up early," I said, my voice sounding deeper, more intimate in the morning air. She didn't look up. "I have always preferred the dawn, Your Grace. It is the only time when the world hasn't yet been told what to think." I took my seat at the head of the table, watching her. The fire from last night was buried beneath layers of duty and pride, but I knew it was there. I could still feel the phantom pressure of her thighs against mine. "We need to discuss the household, Seraphina, and the expectations of the neighborhood. There will be a ball in a fortnight to celebrate our union." She finally looked at me, her eyes sharp. "To celebrate a lie? To show the world that the Duke of Windermere isn't bothered by which sister he beds, as long as the title is secure." "I am bothered," I said, leaning forward, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I am bothered by the fact that I spent the night memorizing the curve of your spine instead of sleeping. I am bothered by how much I want to drag you back upstairs and prove to you that what happened was no lie." Her breath hitched, and for a fleeting second, the mask slipped. That was a moment of weakness. "It will not happen again." "Weakness?" I let out a low, cynical laugh. "Is that what you call it?" "I felt your heart racing against mine, Seraphina. I felt the way you arched into me. If that was weakness, then I am the weakest man in England." "Stop," she hissed, glancing at the servants by the sideboard. "Have you no shame?" "None where you are concerned," I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "But if you wish to play the part of the frigid wife in the daylight, I shall let you. For now. But understand this, I do not settle for half measures. And I do not forget the way a woman tastes when she is screaming my name." The rest of the morning was a battle of wills. I watched her navigate the estate with a quiet, lethal efficiency that surprised me. She wasn't just a replacement. She was a force. She spoke to the gardeners about the drainage. She reorganized the library, and she did it all with a grace that made the servants look at her with something approaching awe. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the tension between us stretched to the breaking point. We were in the gallery, surrounded by the portraits of my ancestors, men who had merit for power and women who had suffered in silence. "They are judging us," she said, her voice echoing in the long hallway. "They know I don't belong here." I walked up behind her, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the heat of my body. "They are dead, Seraphina. They don't know the way you look when the moonlight hits your skin. They don't know that you are the only thing in this house that is actually alive." I reached out, my hand hovering just inches from her waist. "You said you would never love me. You said this was a prison. But tell me, Duchess, when I touch you, does it feel like a cage? Or does it feel like the only time you've ever been free?" She turned around, her back hitting the cold stone wall, her face inches from mine. The provocation in her eyes was intoxicating. "You think you can win me with words and touches, Alistair? You think a few hours of passion can erase the fact that you would have married my sister without a second thought. I was a fool, I confess, the truth tasting like iron in my mouth. I was looking for a ghost when I should have been looking for a storm. And now that I've found it, I have no intention of letting it pass." I stepped closer, my knees brushing the silk of her skates. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the raw, unadulterated desire that had become our constant companion. I could see the battle raging behind her eyes, the vow she had made against the hunger she felt. "Tonight," I whispered, my lips brushing her ear, "the door to my chambers will be unlocked. If you are as strong as you claim, you will stay in your own. But if you want to feel the fire again, I will be waiting." I walked away without looking back, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm. It was a gamble. I was giving her the power I had spent my life protecting. But as I reached the end of the gallery, I heard the faint, unmistakable sound of a breath catching in her throat. The day of the ball arrived like a mounting fever. Windermere was crawling with the elite of the north, their eyes sharp as razors, searching for any crack in our precarious facade. I spent the afternoon in a state of agitated distraction, the memory of Seraphina in the gallery, pressed against the stone, her breath hitching in her throat, haunting my every thought. She had not come to my room that night. Her pride was a fortress, but I knew the walls were thinning. As I dressed for the evening, my valet's hand seemed too slow, the cravat too tight. I felt like a predator waiting for the moon to rise. When I finally descended the stairs, the ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and false smiles. And then I saw her. Seraphina stood at the top of the staircase, a vision in emerald silk that made her skin look like cream and her eyes like forbidden forests. She didn't look like a replacement. She looked like the only woman who had ever mattered in the history of the St. Clair line. As she walked down, the room fell silent. She carried herself with a regal indifference that made my chest ache with a sudden, sharp pang of something that felt dangerously like love. "You are staring, Alistair," she whispered as I took her hand at the base of the stairs. Her skin was cool, but her pulse was thumping frantically against my palm. But the scandal was not as buried as we hoped. Midway through the first waltz, a hushed murmur rippled through the crowd. The heavy oak doors swung open, and there, disheveled and weeping, was Christable, my intended, the sister who had fled. She looked ruined, her captain nowhere to be seen, her eyes searching the room until they landed on us. The music faltered. The silence was absolute. Seraphina stiffened in my arms, her face turning ashen. "Alistair!" Christable sobbed, moving toward us, ignoring the gasps of the guests. "He left me. He took my dowry and left me in a tavern in Dover. Please, you must help me." I felt Seraphina's hand slip from mine. She took a step back, the emerald silk swirling around her ankles like a dying leaf. The look on her face wasn't anger, it was heartbreak. She saw herself in that moment exactly as she had feared, a temporary placeholder, a shadow to be cast aside now that the right sister had returned. "I will see to her," Seraphina said, her voice hollow and devoid of the fire I had grown to crave. "She is my sister." Seraphina, wait. I reached for her, but she recoiled as if my touch burned. "The contract is broken, Alistair," she whispered, so low only I could hear. "The original has returned to claim her place. Your investment has just lost its value." She turned and fled, not toward the ballroom doors, but toward the darkened gardens. I stood frozen for a heartbeat, the weight of the dukedom in the eyes of the ton pressing in on me. Christable was wailing, my mother was fainting, and the scandal was erupting into a wildfire. But I didn't go to Christable. I didn't care about the dowry, the rumors, or the ruined reputation. I pushed past the shocked guests, ignoring the calls of my name, and ran into the night. I found her by the lake, the moonlight reflecting off the dark water, mirroring the tears on her cheeks. She was shivering, her shoulders shaking with the weight of a lifetime of being second best. "Go back to her," she choked out as I approached. "She is the one you wanted, the one who fits the mold." I grabbed her by the shoulders, forcing her to turn and face me. "Look at me, Seraphina. Look at me and tell me you believe that lie." "How can I not?" she cried, her voice breaking. "I was a sacrifice. I was the one you took because you had no other choice." I hold her against me, my hands tangling in her dark hair, forcing her gaze to lock with mine. I was a blind fool when I signed that contract, but the man who stood in that chapel is dead. The man standing here now would burn this entire state to the ground before he let you go. Crystable is nothing to me but a memory of a mistake. You are the truth I whispered at midnight. You are the only woman I see. The air between us crackled with a desperate, raw energy. Her lips were trembling, her eyes searching mine for the deceit she expected. "Prove it," she whispered, a challenge and a plea all at once. I didn't use words. I crushed my mouth to haze, a kiss that tasted of salt, desperation, and a possessive fury that left no room for doubt. I poured every ounce of my soul into that kiss, claiming her not as a duke claimed property, but as a man claims the air he needs to breathe. In the shadows of the willow trees, far from the prying eyes of the bull, the last of her resistance shattered. The morning after the ball, the world was different. The scandal of Christabel's return was the talk of the county, but inside the walls of Windermere, the air was finally clear. I had sent Crystable to our secondary estate in the south, with a generous allowance and a stern warning. She would be cared for, but she would never again stand between me and the woman who had truly claimed my soul. I found Seraphina in the conservatory, the morning light filtering through the glass panes, illuminating the silver-green leaves of the ferns. She wasn't wearing slate gray today. She wore a gown of soft lavender, and for the first time, her expression wasn't a mask of defiance. It was something softer, something that made my heart hammer against my ribs like a schoolboy's. "You sent her away," she said, her voice steady as she turned to face me. "I sent her to where she can find peace, Seraphina. But more importantly, I sent her to where she can no longer cast a shadow over you." I walked toward her, my boots clicking rhythmically on the tiled floor. "I told you last night, and I will tell you every day for the rest of our lives. You are not a replacement. You are the only choice I would make, knowing what I know now." She looked down at her hands, the wedding ring I had placed there in a moment of cold duty now catching the sun. I spent my whole life being the sister who didn't matter, Alistair, the one who was too much or not enough. It is hard to believe that a man like you, a man who could have anyone, would choose a difficult one. I reached her then, taking her hands in mine. They were warm, and they didn't tremble. "Then let me spend the rest of my days proving it to you. I don't want a woman who is enough, Seraphina. I want a woman who is everything. I want the fire, the sharp tongue, and the heart that was brave enough to marry a man she hated to save a family." I leaned down, my forehead resting against hers. "I whispered a truth to you at midnight, under the willows. Do you remember?" She looked up at me, her dark eyes swimming with a mixture of hope and heat. "You said I was the only thing you saw." And I meant it. I growled, my voice thick with the emotion I had spent years suppressing. "I love you, Seraphina, not because of a contract, not because of a name, but because you are the only soul who has ever dared to look at mine and tell me I was more than a title." The kiss that followed was no longer a battle. It was a promise, a slow, deep exploration that tasted of a future we had both thought impossible. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the conservatory, I felt the last of the ice around my heart finally shatter. We would have our challenges. The tongue would whisper, the ghost of the past would occasionally knock at the door, but as I pulled my wife closer, feeling the curve of her body against mine, I knew they couldn't touch us. I had married a stranger in her sister's place, and she had vowed never to love me. But in the silence of the north, amidst the rain and the moors, we had found something far more powerful than duty. I used to believe I could control everything, but I was wrong. And as I looked into Seraphina's eyes, I realized that losing control to her was the only way I had ever truly found myself. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It truly helps us bring you more tales of love, betrayal, and destiny. And if your heart still craves more, explore the other stories waiting for you here. You might just find your next obsession.